I think we'll get started, everybody. And welcome again to everybody online. This is the Reimagining the Concrete Jungle, Embracing the Resurgence of Blue Zones. And it's an event that's organized by Rainproof NYC, which is a discussion, we'll hear more about it, that's been organized by Rebuild by Design and One Architecture and a number of city agencies, all to talk about heavy rainfall in New York City. And so to kick us off, we're very pleased to have Dr. Maurizio Diaz-Grandos, the head of NYBG Science, here to say a few words about plants and water and what we do here at the garden. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So good afternoon, everyone. As Eric said, my name is Maurizio Diaz-Granados. I'm the Chief Science Officer and Dean here at the New York Botanical Garden. And I want to give you the welcome to all Rainproof NYC, to NYBG, and everybody listening to us online. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. As you know, I don't know how familiar you are with the NYBG. This has been a connective hub among people, plant, and the planet since 1891, its founding. We are rooted in the cultural fabric of the New York City, in the heart of the Bronx, which is the greenest borough in the city. And for more than 130 years, we have led scientific research worldwide. We work in this moment in 79 countries. We have over 72 projects in total in the science division. We have about 120 scientists working everywhere. At the moment, as we speak, for instance, one of our researchers is in Vietnam, and the other one is traveling from New Caledonia to Vanuatu. So, and this gives you a little bit of the scale. Next week, I will have a researcher traveling to the Amazon forest in Brazil, and so on. So this is an institution that has a global impact. In our 250 acres, we are home of renowned exhibitions, immersive botanical experiences, art, music, events, but also some of the most important scientific collections. In fact, as part of NYBG Science, we oversee the largest botanical library under one roof, this one here, with more than 12 million items. One of the largest herbaria in the world, with about 8 million specimens, the largest of the Western Hemisphere, the most important herbarium in the Americas, so really important collections. In addition to that, we have a laboratory that is a world-class laboratory called Laboratory of Integrative Biodiversity Research that allow us to carry out research from molecules to ecosystems. And we have now 3 centers of research: the Center for Biodiversity and Evolution, the Center for Plants, People, and Culture, and the Center for Conservation and Restoration Ecology, led by Eric. We have a graduate studies program that is overarching. We work with 7 universities in the city, 6 in the city and 1 in the country. And we, at the moment, we have 21 PhD students. That gives you a little bit of the flavor of our scientific research. We've been leading botanical research for decades. And some of the most important contributions to the knowledge of plants, fungi, and algae come from NYBG. So I want to share this with you because we are proud of being here of NYBG. This is your home, but it's also couldn't be a better site to unite nature with people and with the challenges that we are facing at the moment. I wanted to share that with you that I am from enter this one? Maybe. Oh, maybe because it's not on the presentation. We'll have to click the presentation, maybe.
Maybe. Rafal.
So I think it's because we are in the Chrome, we have to go to the presentation. There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I am from this city down there, from Bogota, Colombia. That's where I was born. And in terms of demography, it's quite similar to New York. We have 9 million people living in this city, similar to New York. You see the geographic map, satellite view, and that map on the right, which is the ecological structure of Bogota. You might be able to see that there's lots of rivers in the city. There's 127 rivers crossing the city east to west, and also coming from the south to north and so on. So that's why Bogota was founded in this area by the Spanish almost 500 years ago. When they came to the Savannah of Bogota, this is what they found. So it was like the high plains fully inundated by these wetlands with rivers, the mountains on top, with the Paramo ecosystem, which is the main source of fresh water, lots of rivers, water everywhere, fresh water. So it was a beautiful, wonderful, full of resources landscape. And this is the city right now. So the whole environment has been totally transformed. If we go to how it would be seen from the top of the mountains, looking down towards the valley, you would see all these wetlands and rivers. Very important ecosystem full of water. And this is what we have now. So we have cemented the entire system. We have planted eucalyptus to dry all these rivers. We have all these 127 rivers. We have put them in canals, and the water has disappeared. And maybe you have seen in the last days that now the Colombia's capital announces new measures to cut water consumption. We have a crisis in a 9 million people city because there's no enough water. So which is totally contradictory. I wanted to bring this example because as we now think about what's going to happen with the water here in New York, some cities that had all the water, now they don't have more water. And this is because of our relationship with the environment. And sometimes it's been just left unattended. And this is a wake-up call to everybody, because ultimately that affects us deeply. And hopefully from these conversations that you're having and for the talk that you're going to have today, we make a better planning of our urban environments in harmony with nature. So this is what I wanted to tell you. I want to thank everybody for attending this space, and I hope you all enjoy this presentation.
Great.
And this
Thank you.
very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mauricio, for such a great introduction. And thank you for allowing us to use this space. I think it's very fitting for our conversation today. Just as an introduction, my name is Rafal Imam, and I'm the Rainproof New York City Fellow at Rebuild by Design. Just a couple housekeeping before I get into an introduction on Rainproof, Rebuild by Design, and the work we're doing and why we're having this event in the first place. So we have dedicated time for Q&A after the presentations by Eric and Nathan, followed by a moderated conversation with Christian, and I'll introduce them all. So for in-person, we're going to pass around this little microphone if you have any questions. For our audience on Zoom, please put any Q&A questions into the provided area, and we're going to have time dedicated for both Zoom and in-person Q&A. And we disabled the chat function for our audience on Zoom just so that we can provide any links. And just generally, if you have any feedback for us or want to add an event to our Rainproof calendar, this is one of the events on our Rainproof event, please email info@rebuildsbydesign.org. Just some background on Rebuild by Design. We like to think of ourselves as a process. We're a nonprofit housed under NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge. And we really think of ourselves as a process that kind of brings together both global and local expertise to solve our most complex and challenging problems, most related to climate change. And why we're here today is we're all experiencing increased flooding from heavy rain, whether it's in New York City or just around the world. And so Rebuild by Design has really been tackling this issue of increased heavy rain since Hurricane Ida. And we put out a number of resources in response from like directly right after Hurricane Ida with the art anthology of ideas towards a Rainproof New York City, and then our kind of research into blue-green infrastructure and how that would look as a benefit cost analysis for New York City. And we've done this with a number of partners from One Architecture to Ramble. And although these are New York City focused, they could really be used to inform any area around the world. We like to think of it as kind of templates of thinking. And our overall goal in our work is to really just to adapt to living with more water. And I think Mauricio kind of touched upon this of like learning to live with nature. So again, fitting location for this event. And currently we're working on Rainproof New York City working groups, which Eric is actually a part of. And the 3 challenges we're addressing is challenge 1, managing increased rain. How can we shift New York City's policies and priorities to create a comprehensive plan to prepare for increasing rainfall? Challenge 2 really addresses housing mobility and what does an equitable buyout program look like for New York City? And challenge 3 is really looking at what are our different roles to play in addressing this issue. So how can we build capacity among communities, the private sector, and CBOs to share responsibility of managing increased heavy rain? And so, as you know, this is one of our many events that we've done about Rainproof New York City, and we have an upcoming input or collaboration session. We just had one yesterday, actually, at the American Museum of Natural History, where people really get to see all the work that we've done in our working groups. And as we're kind of going into June, where we're going to share out and publish our draft recommendations, we want to kind of get every New Yorker's input and as much as a wide reach as we can into, do our recommendations make sense? The recommendations we're going to be ultimately giving to the city and other stakeholders, do you think they reflect what the city wants? And our second session is going to be virtual from 5 to 8 p.m. on May 14th. And then again, kind of going in along with the session is we're putting a public call out for resources and recommendations to really make sure that the working group participants are really seeing all the resources that are available in New York City, because we know people have done tons of work around the city on addressing this issue, but we might not have particular access to it or might not know about it. So just putting a public call out, and so the participants have enough time to really take these resources and recommendations into their final recommendations. We're putting a deadline of May 15th to submit the resources. And then just as a general, our overall events calendar is up on our Rainproof website, and you'll see that there's QR codes around the room that you can use. And that just links you to our Rainproof website that has information about our work, information about the working group participants, and just information on all our calendar of events and all our past recordings. And then I just want to introduce today's event, Reimagining the Concrete Jungle, Embracing the Resurgence of Blue Zones. I know there's already questions in the Q&A function about what does blue zones even mean? So Eric, I think you'll get to that. So I just want to introduce our moderator for today. So Christian Murphy returned to the Bronx River Alliance after spending a season in Western Colorado, performing ecological research for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. He worked as a conservation crew member for the Alliance in 2018. He received a BA in environmental studies from Hunter College and is passionate about preserving and protecting the natural world. He's an avid cyclist, amateur nature photographer, and lover of birds, plants, and insects. So a fitting moderating for today. So I'll introduce Christian up to the screen and he'll take over our event from today. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Rafal, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be introducing our 2 phenomenal panelists this evening. First, I'd like to introduce Eric Sanderson. Eric is an ecologist, conservationist, and an author. He wrote Mannahatta, A Natural History of New York City, and Terra Nova, The New World After Oil, Cars, and Suburbs. And he edited Prospects for Resilience, Insights from New York City's Jamaica Bay. He is currently working on books of maps and stories about the pre-European landscape of New York's 5 boroughs. With his colleague, Lucinda Voigt, he has been studying the overlay of blue zones, places that were wet, former streams, wetlands, dunes, and beaches, places that are wet, and places that are predicted to be wet in New York City in the future. Joining Eric this evening is Nathan Kensinger, who is a Brooklyn-based journalist, photographer, filmmaker, and artist whose work explores hidden urban landscapes, post-industrial ecologies, forgotten waterways, and coastal communities endangered by sea level rise and climate change. Over the past 20 years, he has created a series of photo essays, documentary films, public art projects, and video installations about New York City's changing waterfront. His photographs have been exhibited at the Museum of the City of New York, the Queens Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and Staten Island Museum. And his films have screened internationally at the National Museum of Cinema in Italy, Australian Centre for the Moving Image, and the Danish Film Institute. He is currently an environmental journalist with bylines at various publications, including Gothamist, New York City's public radio station, and he's a senior fellow at the New York City College of Technology's Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. With that, I think I'm turning it over to Eric.
Yeah. Thank you, Christian. Yes. So I'm going to make a short presentation about blue zones, and then Nathan's going to make a short presentation about some of his work, and then we're going to sit down with Christian and have a conversation. And then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. And if we still have time and energy, then for those of you that are here at the garden, I'm happy to take you on a little walk around the garden so you can enjoy the environment. Great. Thank you, Rafal. And sorry, everybody, for that slight delay. Yeah, so the soggy city. So this is work that Lucinda Royd, who just ran out to get her computer, and I've been doing for the last 9 months or so. And why are we interested about rain in New York City? Well, it's because the climate is changing, of course. And thank you. I think we're all set for now. Yeah. Thank you, you too. And that's because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means the atmosphere holds more heat, and more heat can hold more water capacity. And you see that reflected in the temperature curves, the anticipated temperature curves for New York City, as well as the precipitation curves going forward. So at least in our city, as opposed to Bogota, it's going to get warmer here, and it's going to get wetter here going forward. And it's completely fascinating to read the reports of the city about this issue over the last 10 years or so, because you can see the city being a little bit worried, but then, you know, I'm sure we can fix it. And then we can be resilient, we can be strong. And then I think especially after Hurricane Ida, people were like, oh no, like this is really bad, you know, because the pipes are only a certain size, and the pipes were designed a long time ago for a certain climate, and that climate is changing.
Oh.
So, and you know, that's like the many responses, and one of those responses is actually what's happening now with this.
Never get the colors you want because they
which is
don't
actually
always
kind of an innovative thing.
forever.
This is actually the city, with some help from Rebuild by Design,
extra
asking
small and
for
then
advice about what we should do, trying to actually open up the process.
And then we have to like,
so that's the reason that I've been involved.
Whatever.
And you can see why if you look at a
It's
satellite
going to be
image
more
from
of
New
it's
York
going to be
City
that light blue
today,
on top instead of the blue.
You know, it's mostly a gray city, and so it's a coastal city. You can see there's development right up to the edge of the city,
probably for the
but also up to the top of the watersheds.
it's nice. They feel nice.
Particularly startling if
I
you
really
think
wanted
about
the
it
icier
the way
blue.
I do, which is in the context of what was here 400 years ago.
You wanted this one.
Yeah,
This is
but it would be problematic.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't come in
The big sizes or the smallest size.
but I have a mic here.
Then we'd end. I
Yeah, I
know
don't-
it's, but
It's okay.
it's fine. We'd end up with.
Can you hear me okay?
We can't have. Well, you get it. We can't.
Yeah.
I don't want to be like you're sorry you don't fit these sizes. You get a special shirt.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
Tough color. It's like a unique color.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't seem to have access to
Yeah.
Because like
that
that,
screen with my mouse.
the more sky blue that you're holding is pretty readily available.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as well.
yeah,
Hello.
I get that.
It's not
Oh, I mean, that matches really.
It's very, yeah, it's like in
Can you hear me okay? Yes, I can't get over there for some reason. Oh, there you go. You can hear me fine? Okay. Okay. All right. I'm just going to keep heading forward. heading forward by going back in time. So if we imagine what the landscape of New York City was like when Europeans first arrived in 1609, this is what it might have looked like. So the light green colors on this map are the forests, and the light green colors are the salt marshes. And you can see, if you look carefully compared to the image I showed you before, you can see how the, oops, no, I need to come back. Well, Lucy, how do I get back? Now I can't advance the slides. Well, you can just see how much the landscape has changed. Okay, now let's see it over here. Thanks. And that's important because we actually live in kind of an aquatic city. Think about the climate of New York City. On average, we get about 4 inches of rain every month over the course of the year. And that's the reason it was once forest all the way around the city, because a mixed deciduous forest needs to have regular rainfall in order to work. The reason we have these extensive salt marshes and beaches along the shore is because we're a coastal city, right? And as the glaciers melted away, the sea level rose and brought it up to this particular level. And that has a lot of consequences for the way water would interact with the city. So when this area was a forest and it would rain, some of the water would be captured by the canopy, some would flow down the stems, some of it would, fall directly through, miss all the leaves and come into the ground and run off into streams and then down into the groundwater. So that's the process of infiltration. But of course, the trees and the plants are doing something else, which is evapotranspiration. So they're bringing water up out of the soil and putting it back into the atmosphere. And if you compare that to the city today, the very same place, precipitation still falls, but the idea is it's supposed to drain away into the storm drains, the runoff, and then be conveyed through pipes, and then to the water treatment plant, and then out to the sea. And so, this actually, the climate is changing, so we're getting more precipitation, but at the same time, the ground is much more impervious. And so we're actually increasing the flood potential of the city because of the way the city is designed. And if you sort of see this in terms of these stock and flow diagrams the hydrologists draw, if it was a forest and it rained in the forest, then you would have storage within the forest, within the soil of the forest. You would have infiltration down into the groundwater. You would have had lots of evapotranspiration going back up into the sky, which meant that there was relatively little flow, but when that flow did come out, it would go into a stream. And of course, upstream from the forest, there would be, water coming in from a stream. And that's exactly what a stream would be. So the forest was actually a very effective way of managing water in New York City. So when it's a street instead, it's a little hard to see, it rains, but you actually have, little storage in the street. The street really can't store the water. There's little evapotranspiration now because there's fewer trees. There's little infiltration because it's impervious. So what that means is there's a lot of flow off the street, right? And then of course the street is also in a topographic watershed. It's receiving water from upstream. And that's why we get floods, right? A flood is just, too much water. In the past, streams were actually designed to flood on a heavy rain, right? That was actually part of the way they worked ecologically. But cities are not designed to handle floods, which is why everybody's so concerned. And this is what I've been arguing in Rainproof, is the difference between a hydrologic perspective on the way water moves through this landscape, as opposed to a hydraulic perspective. And what we're trying to think about is how could you put those two together in such a way that we can manage water even with climate change into the future. So the work that Lucy and Jesse and my colleagues do is around the historical ecology of the city, where we take these historical maps and we georeference them to the city. And then from these, we reconstruct layers of what the landscape was like in the past. We actually digitize features off them and then build these models of the topography and the hydrology and the depth under the water, right? So the topographic conditions, the surface topographic conditions, and the soil conditions and the geologic conditions that underlie that. And then we lay into that synthesized version of the historic hydrology of the city. And you can see the city was blessed, maybe not quite as much as Bogota, but the city was blessed with many, many streams. And you can see that they're actually a higher stream density in the Bronx and in Manhattan and in Staten Island compared to Long Island. And that's because of their sort of geological foundations, that the bedrock's very close to the surface here and in Manhattan and in Staten Island. And Long Island is essentially a big pile of sand, to simplify, with aquifers in it. And so when the water would fall there, it would tend to go down into the ground right away. And so you have relatively fewer streams. And the streams you do have, like those ones in Southeast Queens, they were mostly groundwater fed. So it's actually water coming out of the groundwater and feeding those streams. And of course, you can take away the topography and see the distribution of these hydrologic ecosystems across the whole city, and then compare it to the city is today, because it's because it's all been georeferenced. So this is how it helps us understand where the flooding is happening. And this is where this idea of blue zones come from. And so the notion is that if there was a place that used to flood in the past, because it was a stream or a wetland or a pond or a lake or a beach or actually in the ocean, it was actually in the ocean, and it's flooding today, and it's predicted to flood in the future, that these are places that we need to do something about. These are what we call blue zones. They're places that require flood adaptation in the city. And because of our work over the last 25 years on the historical ecology, we can say a lot about where it used to flood. We can talk about where it's flooding today from things like the 311 call record, or from the DEP has been doing these stormwater resiliency maps. This is the moderate flooding scenario with current sea level rise. This is what a reasonably large size storm would do today. And then, of course, the US government through FEMA has been making these preliminary flooding assessments, which are mostly about sort of coastal storms. And then there are these future looks into it. So taking climate change into account and trying to look at where it'll flood in the future under a moderate flooding scenario with 2050 sea level rise or 2080. And it's actually this map, their 2080 map with an extreme storm, that led to this idea. Because if you look at this and you sort of squint at it, you see it looks a lot like the historic streams, right? And over the years, I've been talking to DEP about what we've been finding. And so when they came up with this, independent of our work, we thought, well, now this is how we should put them together. You can add in the 500-year storm event for a future flood event. And then we analyze these across the blocks of the city. So we use these atomic polygons, as they're called, as the unit of analysis. We combine them together. We subdivide the very large ones, like LaGuardia Airport, which doesn't have a street grid going across it, so that it's kind of a comparable analysis across the whole city. And then we assemble sets of blocks by criteria to make what's called a blue zone. I'll just skip this for now, but it's just to say that none of these data sets is a perfect representation of flooding in the past, in the present, or in the future. They all have their kind of idiosyncrasies, but what we're really looking for is the thing that goes across the idiosyncrasies, that says something jointly. And we do that by basically talking about if 10% of the area of a block, was a stream or a wetland or a marsh, and it has at least 5 311 calls, or 10% falls in one of the DEP models or in the FEMA flood zone, or 10% in the future. And if you put all 3 of these together, that's what makes a blue zone. So Lucy made this great figure that kind of shows this together. So these are all the blocks of the city that were historically wet, right? And so that's about 34% of the city. This is the present flooding pattern, which is actually more, it's 47%. It's actually kind of shocking if you look at the 311 call data for the city, how much flooding there's happening. Sometimes that's extreme rainfall. Sometimes it's about catch basins, right? Sometimes it's about potholes. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why. But you can see it, flooding is kind of endemic already in New York City. And then there's the future flood scenarios, which is also about 47%, but a different distribution of the city. And so then you can start putting these together. So if you put the past and the present together, you get this map, it's 21%, or the past and the future, that's 25%, and so forth and so on. And so this last map is the blue zone map, which is showing you, if you put all 3 together, it's 19% of the city in terms of the land area of the city, or about 21% of the blocks are in these blue zones. So these are areas that, by definition, did flood in the past, are flooding today, and are predicted to flood in the future, right? So that's the argument. That's what we need to do. And it's 20%. I think that's an important figure. So this is not just a few isolated places in the city. It's about 1/5 of the city we're talking about. But it's also not all of the city. There's, some blocks that even in the 2080 most extreme scenario are not predicted to be flood prone. So it's serious, but it's also, we have room to run here in New York City. Sometimes people exaggerate and say the whole city is going to be underwater. And I think that is actually an exaggeration and not a helpful one. And so what we've done is taken these blue zones across the city. We've named and numbered all of them. There's 369 altogether. And then, because we know about the names of the historical ecology, we can actually give them names, Hunts Cove or Lower Harlem Creek or what's the other one? Anyway, each one of them has a name based on its historical ecology. We can analyze the types of flooding that are happening. Is it coastal flooding? Is it upland pluvial flooding? Is it a combination of those based on the input data sets? And then we can overlay it with the census data to look at how many people. And break that down by borough. So it's about 11% of people in New York City live in one of the blue zones. And also the buildings, it's about 9% of the structures of the city. I will say we're still working on the final numbers, so these might change a little bit from where they are now. And then, you can do summaries across the whole city. Interestingly, we've been also looking at land tenure. So who manages those blocks, right? Which ones are private? Which ones are public? Which ones are in the right of way? And then for the public data, which ones are city? Which ones are state? Which ones are federal? And we can do that both, for the blue zones and for the citywide land tenure as a whole, which means that we can compare them to each other. So interestingly, about half of the city, as you can see on this table here, is private. 48% of the land is private in New York City. The rest of it is managed by government in one way, shape, or form. If you look at the blue zones, you can see that they're about 36% private. So that means the city disproportionately manages blue zone area, which that in itself is interesting to think about. How did that happen, right? And our hypothesis is that these areas that were wet were valued less for private development, and so they tended to stay in the public domain. And then they would be developed as the city needed places to do stuff that they didn't have room for otherwise, like airports or public housing or schools, right, as the city would grow. And you can look at, of course, by city agency or by city agency. It's not surprising that of the city land that's in blue zones, most of that's in parks, or 40% of it's in parks. So parks are a really important part of it. Of course, parks are places we do things other than manage water, right? But I think even more importantly is that the city agencies, they're accustomed to negotiating with each other about what they do with individual parcels of land. And so what what the kind of flooding results are pushing is, for the DEP to talk to the Parks Department, and Parks Department to talk to the Transportation Department. And so when you're walking around the city with city agency, they're always thinking about this. This is like uppermost in their mind. Who's managing which piece? What plans are in train for that piece of land? And then how can we work it together to try and make flood protection? So just then to summarize sort of our draft results so far. So a blue zone is a group of contiguous blocks that were wet, are wet, and predicted to be wet in the future. We have 369 of them named and numbered for the original aquatic features of those places. It's about 20% of the blocks of the city, about 19% of the land area, about 985,000 New Yorkers, about 101,000 structures. So it's not a small problem. And this is just the minimum, right? Remember, the future was like 47%. So, but the idea is maybe if we do something in these blue zones, that'll actually help us with the places elsewhere that otherwise would be flood prone. Just as importantly for me is, government can't solve this problem for us on its own on land that they already manage, right? There's got to be action on private land, and we have to think about how that happens, what kind of incentives can be given. But that said, what government does on government lands is really important, and particularly the parks have a really important role. And the argument here is that by doing flood adaptation activities in the blue zones, perhaps we can protect the 47% of the city that might be otherwise flood prone. Okay, so what can we do? Well, that's just what Rainproof is all about, is trying to brainstorm and thinking not about just the water, but the equity aspects of it, right? Because that's really important, is that, you know, whatever we do, you know, helps increase the equity of New York City. And what we're doing here, and this is what Maurizio was saying at the beginning, is, you know, we're trying to nature your city. You know, I think bringing more nature back into New York City is how we get through climate change in New York City. That's how we adapt. We need to, instead of pushing nature away, we actually need to lean into nature. But that requires fundamentally rethinking what it means to be living in New York City and what it means to be, you know, be a person, to be a New Yorker in this landscape. All right, and so with that, I'm going to switch over to Nathan and invite him up. Thank you.
That was excellent. That was really actually riveting. I'm totally wondering how many of those 369 blue zones I may have been to or not been to.
Well, yeah, we should have made that map. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm Nathan Kensinger, and I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the projects I've worked on over the last 20 years of looking at New York City's waterfront, in which I've gone to these places that are often frequently flooded and tried to kind of share their stories, bring people to these places, document their histories, excavate kind of maybe why there's flooding or why a neighborhood might have been polluted by some kind of industrial development in the past. So I've been documenting New York City's waterfront since, well, I moved here in 2003, but I've been making documentary films about the waterfront since 2007, doing photo essays and photojournalism since 2007, and creating public art projects on the waterfront since 2011. And this is a view from where I live. I live in Sunset Park, and at the end of my street, this is what I see, a post-industrial kind of semi-abandoned waterfront that's turned into a wild green space at the end of this pier that's collapsing into the New York harbor. And I'd say it's similar to a lot of what I've been looking at on the waterfront of New York City over the last 20 years, is these post-industrial spaces that have sometimes been reclaimed by other species, or that have been left behind to deal with the pollution or the infrastructure that we built there. This is again, the street end about 2 blocks from my house. So some of the themes of my work, I look at post-industrial waterfronts. This is the Greenpoint waterfront, but I've been exploring the whole kind of de-industrialization of New York City's waterfront over the last 20 years, as old factories have been torn down, sugar refineries, you know, shipyards have moved out, and a new city has emerged in its place. I also have been tracking out all the forgotten rivers and streams in the city over the last probably 15 years or so. I have a goal to go to every single one of the creeks and streams in the city and try and tell its story from its head to its mouth. I've done almost all of them in photo essays where I've written about their histories for various publications. There's about 36 or so, about 3 dozen streams that I've found that are still above ground and that have a significant pathway through different neighborhoods in New York City. I've also been documenting a lot of the waterfront neighborhoods that are going through kind of a dramatic transformations as we face sea level rise and storms like Hurricane Sandy. And some of the, oh, that's interesting. The text moved around, but some of the projects that I've worked on include the film Black Mayonnaise, is a documentary film that it's my most recent documentary film that came out in 2022. You can't read the text there, but you get the general idea.
Sorry about that.
Black Mayonnaise looks at the dredging of the Gowanus Canal, the Superfund cleanup on the Gowanus Canal, which was one of the first waterways that I really engaged with when I moved to Brooklyn 20 years ago. And I've been kind of documenting its story ever since. It's just one of the many very polluted, industrialized waterways in New York City that are hopefully being cleaned in some form to allow for other uses and other species. Oh yeah, the text is missing on some of these slides, but this is a slide from my film Managed Retreat, which came out in 2018. A short documentary film about the first 3 neighborhoods in New York City that have essentially been bought up by the state and been demolished to make way, in theory, for a wetland or a green space. So I spent about 1.5 years documenting this process of these neighborhoods as the homes were torn down and the empty land was seeded with a special wetlands mix, and as really watched as the wild animals very quickly came back to these sites that were former marshlands where people had built, bungalows and summer homes that then became year-round homes. I'd say managed retreat, which we might talk about in our conversation, is something that a lot of New York City neighborhoods are going to have to think about. Do we move away from the water? Like, can we still live in some of these areas in flood zones? Yeah, text is weird on this one too, but wetland shadows. This is my most recent project that I worked on all last year with the New York State Council for the Arts grant, where I was digging deeply into the history of one site in Long Island City, the Hunters Point waterfront, and trying to really find the origins of the landscape there, where it was once this large wetland ecosystem with the hill that was then pushed out and filled in the wetlands, and is now a new waterfront park, Hunters Point South Park. So this art project, we went and projected some of the documentation and the research that we had found over this year-long process onto the structures that are now in the park, the flood walls, the logs washed up on the shoreline. We projected the history of the past of this site onto the current landscape in a way to try and remind people of what was once there within this space, and that in a landscape that looks nothing like its historic landscape. Other projects, I now work for the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center at City Tech in Brooklyn. My most recent paper for them was looking at sea level rise on Jamaica Bay, specifically the Brooklyn parts of Jamaica Bay, but all of Jamaica Bay, and thinking about the future of storm surge barriers and managed retreat, which is coming to Jamaica Bay. That's one of the parts of the city that's going to have some of the most radical change, I would say, in the next 10 or 20 years in order to deal with sea level rise and climate change. And an example of some of the articles I write for New York City, or for Gothamist. Most recently, I've been writing for Gothamist and WNYC. I previously had a column at the website Curbed for about 8 years as well. But I've been covering a lot of these coastal climate barriers that are being built around New York City as we think about how to protect the coastline from the storm surges, the erosion, the flooding, which is already happening. There's already neighborhoods in New York City that are going underwater. This is some of my photographs from earlier this year in January in Hamilton Beach on Jamaica Bay, a neighborhood that floods, with every monthly high tide, or maybe twice a month in some cases. There's neighborhoods in New York City that are already going underwater. We're not talking about like an abstract future. There's parts of New York City that are going underwater now and that are facing inundation on like a regular basis already, which is only going to get worse and worse as sea levels rise, as we have more and more rainfall, more intense storms, larger storm surges. So there's a lot of change happening on the waterfront. A lot of it is related to these flood zones that we're going to be talking about. It's related to sea level rise and climate change, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great.
And I'm supposed to end on this slide here. So thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you for your excellent presentation.
Yeah.
I'm excited to dive into this conversation. No pun intended.
That's good.
I guess I want to kick us off with a question for the both of you, which is sort of what drew you to the exploration of blue zones and wet areas in the city? How did you first get your feet wet, so to speak?
You want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned I moved to New York City 20 years ago, and I really had the intent of getting to know as much of New York City as possible, and started with the Gowanus Canal, the waterfront of Red Hook, the Brooklyn waterfront, and just gravitated towards these watery parts of the city, probably because I'm originally from San Francisco, which is another great waterfront city surrounded by water. But I found myself drawn to telling the stories of these parts of the coastline of the city that I felt at the time were not really having their stories very well told, not really having their histories examined very closely.
Yeah. For me, I'm also from California. Originally, I grew up in the Bay Area. But for me, it's sort of the other way around, that like to be in an environment that's forested all the time, or wants to be forested all the time. Here at the garden, we have the Thane Family Forest. It's the only uncut forest in New York City. It has, a river running through it and streams. And My wife was working here at the garden, so I was spending a lot of time in that forest, and it was such a like alien environment for me as a Californian to be in a deciduous forest all the time that that's part of what led to my interest in the historical ecology of New York City. And you know, streams are such an important part, and wetlands. I studied salt marshes in California. I was a salt marsh ecologist for many years, and so I think you know that's always been part of my reckoning. But for me, it was just one part of the other ecosystem. And when I started trying to figure out where the old streams were, it was just to figure out where the old streams were, not necessarily because it would help us with future climate adaptation. You know,
I feel like there's a big overlap between the Bay Area and New York City in terms of the challenges that it's facing compared to what New York City is facing.
Yeah.
Very similar in a lot of
Right,
ways.
right.
Over the course of your work, what are some of the things that have surprised you the most, I would say, as you've been studying things, looking into the past, looking at current conditions? What were you like expecting to find, and what sort of jumped out at you as, wow, I didn't realize that was here? I guess I'll maybe ask Eric first.
Yeah, well, for me, so if you study ecology in California, you're constantly reminded how great and special California ecology is. There's even a book called An Island Called California. That's about its ecology and how special it is. I remember being in a soil science class in graduate school, and the professor was showing these, you know, these diagrams of the climate of like the time of year it rains and the temperature. And I actually raised my hand. I said, that graph from Iowa can't be right because it's raining more in the summer than in the winter. How can that be? And that's just because I was a weird California kid. And so you're told that like the East Coast, you know, maybe it has all these great cities and things, but it was just like a forest. Like just from the edge, you know, all the way to Illinois or something. You know, that there's a story like a squirrel could go tree to tree to tree with never touching the ground, you know, for 1,000 miles. So when I started studying the historical ecology of New York City, I realized that that's actually not the case, that there are all these different kinds of forests, there's all these kinds of wetlands. We're in a coastal and estuarine environment, so there's all this like salinity gradients, you know, brackish marshes, brackish tidal marshes, low salt marshes, high salt marshes, you know, sea level fens, like all these really cool ecosystems. And so at one point I was making the list just for Manhattan, and you know, there were 56 different ecological communities you would have found on Manhattan.
Wow.
Right? It's crazy. And if you compare to, I don't know, like Yellowstone, the map for Yellowstone had 63 types, and there were almost as many just on Manhattan. And our list for Wallachia for the whole city area is 200 ecosystems. So this is an environment that's designed by nature to be super productive, super adaptive, and ecologically super diverse. And I think there's reasons to think that's why it made the city that it did.
Yeah, I've also been surprised by the extent of natural spaces that remain in the city. You know, a lot of them might be hidden away or at the edges of the city here in New York, but I've just been, it's been a pretty fascinating to me to find like all of these creeks and streams, for instance, that are still here. People are always like, well, you know, New York City has a lot of buried streams. And I'm like, no, there's actually like huge. I mean, we have the Bronx River, of course.
Right.
But in all 5 boroughs, there's stream, well, maybe not Manhattan, but in 4 of the boroughs, you have like very
There are
extensive.
even some streams in Manhattan,
Yeah.
like, you know, along in High Bridge Park, you know, where you have those steep slopes.
Yeah.
And even some springs in there.
Yeah,
so.
it's impressive how much green space remains or was protected in a sense in New York City.
Yeah.
That's definitely been a surprise to me because when I moved here, it was looking at this very industrial, you know, very gritty landscape around like Red Hook and Gowanus that had developed over all of those waterways.
Right.
So
Yeah. I also think, you know, it's sort of a glass half full, half empty. You know, people, you know, you think of Manhattan. If you're walking around in Midtown Manhattan, you think, well, okay, where's the nature here, right? But that's just like such a small slice of New York City, even though in the like popular imagination that is New York City, right? But New York City is just so diverse, especially on the 5 borough scale.
Yeah.
So as we're thinking about what the city is going to do, right, with all this water that's always been here, but now it's becoming much more of an everyday issue for us. Eric, I want to ask you, with your expertise in conservation and forest ecology, how do you see those concepts kind of blending together as we begin to adapt and start to change the way that we're doing things here?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the simplest level, I think we've overbuilt the city some.
Yeah.
You know? I think we've just built a little bit too much city in this place. And so, you know, that's why we need to retreat from some places, in my view. You know, over the short term and the long term, And also, I have sort of a kind of geological perspective on the landscape, which does not say that you can resist sea level rise for too long, right? Like when the glaciers were here, the sea level was 100 meters lower, and it was 100 miles to the shore. Like this was, a landscape of hills and valleys with a river running through it, the proto Hudson River. And, it came up all the way to where it was when Henry Hudson got here, right? And it's coming up like another meter, right? Maybe another meter and a half. So that's nothing compared to what it did. And just think we can fight that is just a little nuts to me. And the fact that we think we should fight it as such, I think is a little nuts, And, we live in some places that, I don't know, like a Lenape person would never have lived on the beach the way we live on the beach. Not to say they would not have gone to the beach sometime, but they probably wouldn't have built their wigwam there because they knew it would have blown over and gotten flooded. And yet, that's essentially what we've done in some places. Or, they wouldn't, dig a hole into a wetland and then put their transportation system under it. But that's essentially what some of our subways are, right? So I think like for me, this is, discussions about policy and what we do, but it's also a much larger conversation about how we change our thinking about the landscape and what it means to be a person here and to be a city in this place.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, one of the things that, back to that question of what surprised you, I've been surprised that we really haven't learned the lessons of the past, dating back even to like, the last couple of centuries, but we're continuing to build in flood zones today and developing places like the Gowanus, developing intensively on the Harlem River, developing in areas that flooded in the last major Hurricane Sandy, and building new neighborhoods in places that we know are going to go underwater in the relatively near future. So it's not even just that maybe we need to retreat from neighborhoods that historically were a bad idea in a marshland.
Right.
We're doubling down right now and building in these areas that I'm like, that's going to be underwater. Like the Gowanus Canal, it used to be a wetlands. It's going to be underwater. Like not a good idea to put 10,000 apartments in.
Yeah, I mean, just the economic incentives are such because of the way we sort of aligned what we value through the economic system.
Yeah. I mean, that juxtaposition of you ask an average New Yorker, what is waterfront property? What are those real estate values like? And they'll tell you that's prime real estate, right on the water, great views. That's where you want to be.
Right.
It's not where you want to be.
Right.
That's a mind frame that we have to get away from in New York.
But I would say that's been a relatively recent shift. Like people did not want to be on the water because they weren't even aware of the water. Like let's say 20 years ago, even like there was no access to the water on the East River. It was like factories. People didn't want to be near the factories. And now suddenly we're like, let's build on the sites of these former factories because people do want to be close to the water, which is, on the one hand, it's great. We have waterfront access opening up for the first time in like over a century. But on the other hand, it's, putting.
Well, I think there's even like a deeper historical story there. Like one of the things that's wonderful about New York City history is how you can see like one generation doing something, the next generation's like, nah, that's not the thing, and then trying to fix it in such a way that it creates another problem for there's a great book about the Manhattan waterfront by Ann Buttenweiser. Do you know this book? But she sort of talks about this, how like the Lenape, valued the coast for a place where you go for food, or where you could go to, fish, or you can take your dugout canoe, or you can see just like who's coming, right?
Yeah.
And then, for the Dutch, it was kind of a port place, a place you filled in, right? To live on. But, what they really valued were the salt marshes. Like if you read like the early Dutch who came here, they were very litigious. They were constantly suing each other about one thing or another. Are you having trouble hearing us? Okay. Here in the room, you mean? Oh, okay, sorry. So they would sue each other, but they would sue each other about the tidal marshes because they would cut the marshes for livestock fodder. And there was lots of land, but there weren't that many marshes, relatively speaking. So that's what they really cared about. And then eventually, as the city built out, those marshes became the places we dump stuff in.
Right.
And so there's all these stories of it becoming foul and a health hazard and smelly and then calls to fill them in. And then the next generation would build on top of them. And then sometimes a generation or two, including these industrial areas.
Parks on top of.
And now we're building on parks on that thing.
Turned into landfills.
So,
but I was struck. I mean, I think what have we lost? Like 99% of the salt marsh habitat in the city, something like that. I was looking at one of my old articles. It's like 85% of the wetland habitat and 99% of the salt marsh habitat is just gone.
That's right.
Like we've lost almost all of those types of ecosystems.
And those,
in New York
and those ecosystems are the ones that both protected us from storms
Yeah.
and provided all this biomass into the marine environment that the fish and the phytoplankton
Yeah.
and the whole marine ecosystem worked on.
So I think I would be remiss if I did not ask a question about the Army Corps' harbor and tributary study. If I don't ask it, somebody else will, so I might as well ask it now.
Yeah.
And I guess I can give a little bit of context that this was a study commissioned by the government after Hurricane Sandy to study the vulnerability of the coastline here in the New York metro area and find opportunities maybe to, in some cases, very novel ways of protecting our shorelines here. It was broadly not well received. And so they are going back to the drawing boards.
Very kind person.
We've had lots of conversations over the years, but
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, with your expert opinions, what were your sort of reactions and sort of, wow, that's what they're thinking with that proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I've covered the New York and Harbor Act. What is it? New York and Harbor Tributary Study pretty extensively for different publications, first Curved, then Gothamist, and watched as they've kind of evolved their thinking about the proposal. And I think they're supposed to announce the next stage of that at some point very soon, telling us what the Army Corps of Engineers has decided will be kind of the fate of New York City. But the most recent iteration of the proposal was to build some 40 miles of walls along the coastline of New York City and 12 storm surge gates in a lot of these historic creeks and the mouths of the creeks. And so one of the pieces that I wrote was about all the environmental groups that deal with these streams and the wetlands and natural areas that are related to these streams and rivers, and their alarm at the idea of building storm surge gates in the water that could potentially impact the ecosystem there that they've been nurturing or trying to restore for, decades and decades. So it'll have a pretty major impact. I mean, if the Army Corps proposal goes through, I think it'll be the biggest thing to impact New York City's waterfront in the future, because it's going to transform everything. You see the renderings of it, but it's like, here's a new park that we finally got on the waterfront of Greenpoint that used to be industrial. The rendering is here's a giant concrete wall.
Yes.
But it'll be that way throughout the whole city. So it is challenging. I mean, it's like the federal government is saying we need, I think it was like 81 billion. It's in the 80 billion number. We need to have it like 80 something billion dollars of walls and levees and storm surge gates to protect us from what's coming our way. So that's pretty serious that the federal government is acknowledging that that's where we're at. Like, we're facing some very dire future. So something does need to be done, or the neighborhoods along the coast. Many of the neighborhoods along the coast will go underwater in the near future. On your map there, the Rockaways is flooded. Coney Island is flooded permanently, potentially. So something, if you want to continue to live in some of these parts of the coastline, something does need to be done.
When I first looked at it, I had a couple of responses. One is, that even though it's supposed to be the plan for the whole city, it actually, there's big parts of the city it doesn't protect either.
Like the Bronx.
The Bronx, I mean,
Nothing
be interested
proposed.
in your thoughts.
There's
But,
like nothing proposed for the Bronx.
I'm sure you do. But like, so like, if you're going to go all in, but not everything, and I think it's because the money thing, because to go all in would be so much. And so I think there's that important point to say.
Yes.
Another important point is remember the Robert Moses point, which is, why did Robert Moses, why was he the power broker? It's because he realized that when you build infrastructure, you get jobs, and jobs give you power, economic power. And so I can't help but, think about any big plan like that and not think about Robert Caro and the story about Robert Moses, right? And who's going to have access to that power, and who's going to have access to that money, and who's advocating for it, right? Because I think, you just got to go to the core of the rationale. And then the third thing I think about it is it would lock us into at least another 100 years of concrete and cement on the coast, and predisposes to more concrete. Once you build a piece of infrastructure, then you tend to think you have to protect that infrastructure with more infrastructure, right? So it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, all those reasons, I think we just should say no. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree. So as we're thinking about flooding management, waterfront protections, and infrastructure, are there any aspects that are actually not well researched or well understood even at this point? Or are we do we think we know everything about what we need to do?
I mean, I think it depends on who's the
Yeah.
we here.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, I think most people in New York City are not aware of what is being planned and proposed for the future of New York City. They're not even really aware that we're already building like $4 billion of coastal defenses right now that are demolishing beaches and demolishing parklands in order to put up walls. Those are happening like right now, like in the East Side Coastal Resiliency and
Staten Island.
Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. They just demolished like a whole ton of trees in order to put in a new seawall there, but it wasn't really covered anywhere in the news that I could see.
Right.
And so we're already, massively changing our landscape to protect us from flooding and sea level rise and storms. But I think, unfortunately, it's not common knowledge. It's not really like something that people are paying too much attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot that needs to be learned too. Those stormwater resiliency maps that I showed you, which are a very valuable thing, but I didn't take you through the caveats, but one of the caveats is that they just ignored all the parks when they did the analysis. Because it wasn't under DP's jurisdiction. They didn't know where the drainage pipes were, so they just left them out of the analysis. But it's like 40% of the land area of the city that actually does things to water. So there's that. There's also a very, if you're the kind of person who likes to read appendices, read the second appendices to that report. It's a reanalysis of a part of Queens where they did it first with their map of the drainage, and then they made a better map because it turns out they don't even know where all their pipes are. For understandable reasons. Some of them were built a long time ago and nobody always had the good maps about it. But they have a system of the pipes that the consultants use to represent the city. But if you improve it, you get a different pattern of flooding. So that's super interesting. And then all of these models, you have to parameterize them. You have to understand how like the water is going to interact with the different ecosystems. And so we need a lot more data and understanding about that. One of the ideas I've been trying to push here at the garden is that we should equip, this 250-acre site as a laboratory of ecosystems to monitor when it rains really hard, where does the water go in the forest and where does it go in the wetland? How much goes into the river, but also, and then compare that with what's happening on the lawn out here and on the sidewalk and on the street and on this building. So you get like these big comparisons. You can actually say, well, this is what a building's doing. This is what a sidewalk's doing. If we built a bioswale, this is what it could do. And we could, experiment with that, putting different kind of plants, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's a lot of that kind of just basic research that you would think somebody had already done, but it's actually not been done.
I was going to say, you mentioned bioswales. That's something that it's such a new thing that we've already installed like thousands and thousands of bioswales around broad swatches of the city. But I don't think that necessarily we've studied yet what the effect is because so many of them are just completed. But in case you don't know about, they put in like rain gardens or bioswales that when it rains, the rain, instead of going straight into the storm drain, cuts into like a tree pit or some other function that helps kind of capture the rainwater instead of it flowing directly out to your local waterway. And I'm curious, like I don't know yet what the impact of that is, but that's like I would point to that as one of the most interesting pieces of green infrastructure that's been built. I was
just in Corona on Saturday, walking around with an artist. We're doing a project about the new cloudburst project. DP has this cloudburst program to help intense rainfall events, and that's one of the areas. And you look at the map of the sites, and they're just they look like they're just sort of randomly distributed, like in salt and pepper in the neighborhood. And it had all to do with the opportunity place, not necessarily where the drainage lines were. And so, and you can see some of them are stomped on, some are full of garbage, some are very well tended and kind of beautiful. And some have trees, some have the trees cut down.
It's a pretty grand, it's a pretty massive experiment.
That's right.
Use the word grand, but it's a huge experiment.
That's right.
I'm very curious to see what happens. Because we've invested in like building really thousands of these and many hundreds more on the way now.
One of the interesting things from the DEP perspective is a lot of that was about water quality, trying to keep water from going into the combined sewer outfalls and then messing up the harbor water quality. And now they're also being asked to manage water quantity, right?
Right.
Which, maybe that's what they're designed for, maybe not. So
Yeah, not necessarily for floods, but maybe they'll impact flooding.
yeah, we'll see.
As we're thinking about land usage, right, and where these bioswales are versus where the blue zones are, and that maybe they're not being very strategically placed, how much opportunity is there to put stormwater capturing devices, whether the bioswales or rain gardens or rain barrels or some other kind of technique, in these locations that are historically and going to be wet,
Right.
or are those places already too crowded and too built out?
I think we definitely need some incentives for people that have private land.
Right.
What's that? Okay. You'll let us know when we should move to the Q&A? Okay. Okay, yeah, thanks. We definitely need some sort of incentives so people realize that the way they manage their land has to do something with water, right?
Yeah.
And like you cement in your driveway, that has a consequence for everybody, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do that but anyway, it should be like in your calculus for thinking about how you manage your little bit of New York City. And then there needs to be some capacity. And this is, I think, one of the things that Rainproof is really struggling with, which is water works at the landscape scale, right?
Mhm.
It starts at the top of the watershed and then it goes downhill. And it really doesn't care who owns what piece of land or whatever. It doesn't care how complicated it is. It just wants to go downhill and get to the ocean. That's what it wants to do. So, but the city is so finely textured in terms of its ecosystems, in terms of its management, in terms of people's willingness and capacity to do this, that, or the other thing, that it becomes so hard to deal with anything that works at the landscape scale. I mean, transportation is sort of a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in parts of the city that developed earlier into this dense urban fabric, it's much more challenging to build these massive interventions. Thinking back on the Gowanus, they're trying to put in like huge holding tanks for stormwater and sewage overflow, and they have to like demolish buildings and uproot, whole blocks to build these things. But then if you look at like Staten Island, it was developed more recently into a dense kind of residential area, and because of that, they were able to build like the Staten Island Blue Belt system,
Right, exactly.
which I think that to me is like one of the most unique systems in New York City that they were able to create that. It's a whole system of preserving, but then engineering the historic creeks of Staten Island to become a better channel for the rainwater that was flooding all the homes that were being built in the 70s and into the 80s, and that are still being built. So to address the flooding, they took the historic streams, re-engineered them, put in holding ponds, put in, retention basins, things like that, while preserving some aspect of the natural environment that was there. And it's kind of too late to do. You can't go reverse engineer like Manhattan or the Bronx necessarily to daylight a stream, tear down all the buildings and turn it into a green space. But there are small pieces that you can do, like the daylighting of Tibbetts Brook, for instance, to take that out of the sewer system and create a new green space where the waters from Tibbetts Brook and the Bronx can flow. So you can do it. It just is much more difficult in these like super dense urban areas in some of the boroughs.
I know our audience is brimming with questions, but I do just want to squeeze in one last one, which is managed retreat. And I'm curious to know how that process looked in the 3 neighborhoods that's happened in, and what we might expect going forward in New York City.
Yeah, definitely. The neighborhoods I documented were these 3 communities in Staten Island that were pretty badly damaged in Hurricane Sandy, and then collectively went to the state and asked to be bought out, and asked the government to help them move out of their neighborhoods en masse. And then the neighborhoods were demolished and ostensibly returned to nature or to some green space. How it's played out, again, it's kind of an experiment, like the bioswales. Like, it's the first time we've done a managed retreat in New York City and like taken down a neighborhood and theoretically given it back to being some kind of wetland buffer. I would say when I made my film, it was this hopeful moment. The houses were being demolished, the wild animals were coming back, the wildflowers were growing. That hasn't necessarily followed through into the present day. Like today, there's been all these problems of like the wildflowers and the marshlands being mowed frequently into
Oh,
like
yeah.
lawns, or
Lot of invasive
Phragmites coming
species,
in
yeah.
and taking over, or in some of the neighborhoods, like they sold the land off and people started parking trucks illegally on the former home sites where people had like moved away. It's a manage your trees, it's a pretty challenging thing. I mean, I do think as a concept, it is a pretty interesting idea that we should not be living in some parts of the city that we've developed. We should be moving away and opening that land up for flooding or for water or other things. But in reality, it's not clear yet how that would play out were we to undertake an even larger managed retreat in the city. This is a very small one, and I don't think it's going too well right now, but it's going to take decades to see how it really plays out.
I mean, there is a working group in Rainproof that's thinking about what a buyout program would look like. What would an equitable buyout program look like for New York City? So, and you know, this is something the city is participating in. So they're actually having the conversations.
Yeah.
I think everybody recognizes how fraught it is on so many different dimensions. And even how, like, you know, real estate prices have changed since the time of Hurricane Sandy and so forth. One of the lessons that I've learned through that I think is really interesting is that you know, if you have a disaster, you have a big flood event, and then you start your buyout program afterwards, you know, it takes time to do that. And then people start to rebuild, because what are they going to do? And then they don't want to take the buyout program. It's better and more efficient if there's an existing one. You're not telling anybody they have to go, but they're saying these parts of the city are flood prone. Almost everybody who lives in flood prone parts of the city know they're flood prone, right? Like, it's not a surprise to them. And so that gives them an option either before the flood or, you know, in the worst case, right after the flood, to say, okay, that's enough, you know, the third time or the fifth time or the 10th time, I just can't do this anymore. And then I'm going to go. But, you know, you have to set it up in a way that's equitable. I spoke to some colleagues at the Environmental Defense Fund and the Regional Plan Association last week. And they have a project where they're trying to get the housing advocates to work with the environmental advocates, right? Because those two things often get pitched against each other to nobody's benefit. But, you know, if we're going to have a city that's going to have 8.8 million people, if we decided that's what we want, 8.8 million people, and you're going to take out housing somewhere, then you have to add housing someplace else. And so there's this also very fraught conversation about densifying some parts of the city that are less dense, and all the NIMBY issues about that. And we all know that the city suffers for a lack of affordable housing already, and that more housing would help that. And so, you know, this is, you know, it's very, very difficult. But this is why I love New York City, because like there are all these, like, you know, people trying to work it out and testing on the edges all around and having conversations with each other and being kind of being proactive about it, right? So it's difficult, but you know, and I don't know if it's going to work. I can't make any promises, but at least there are people trying.
Like, being proactive is good. I mean, there's like dozens of neighborhoods that if we do nothing, will just continue to flood worse and worse, and people will suffer and die. People are suffering already, and will have much more suffering and fatalities in the future coming storms. I mean, it is kind of a dire situation that if we do nothing, you know, there will be great loss of property.
But maybe just to say something, an optimistic point, like, you know, the city only changes like through crises, and so if this is our crisis, let's use it to change, to make the city that'll be a great city 100 years from now. By being smart about how we make these hard sacrifices now, but we're actually giving to the future instead of taking to the future. From the future.
Being proactive.
So the bottom line is, it's not too late.
Never too late.
All right. I guess I'd like to turn it over to Rafal and anyone else who might have questions in the room and online.
Do you want to take from Zoom first, or does our audience here have a question?
I have a question.
Here you go.
Well, it's sort of, I've always thought if Robert Moses could use eminent domain for putting in highways, we could use eminent domain to take some out, you know. And I've also thought a lot about the passageways that the Lenape used from Jamaica Bay to Flushing Bay, and that was a trading route, which is now the Van Wyck. that could make a great forest path, that could be put back in and take out, some of that. I mean, I think that what you said about thinking about 100 years from now, what this city could be and what should a city be, what should a city of the future look like, that's really what we should be thinking about. And, it sounds like, I mean, I know there are a lot of people thinking about this, but I think about it all the time because I'm thinking I live in Queens and there are so few neighborhood parks even. Just there are big parks, but for people to get to them or have any greenery, there's really nothing. And it seems that the real estate industry has the say on what happens. And I've also talked to mortgage brokers who were funding, luxury housing, and they confirmed to me that a lot of that housing is half empty. So when we say that there's a shortage of housing, there really isn't. So, it's like it's gotta be some, I don't know. There's a frustration there I have. Anyway, I'm not really asking a question. I'm sort of pontificating, so please excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess about the original question you had in terms of eminent domain, if you compare like eminent domain, which is like the government coming in and telling people what to do and seizing property, to something like managed retreat, where a community says, we need to get out of here, please help us relocate. It's two different processes. Eminent domain isn't what they're calling it, but certainly the government has already gone in and said, we're going to take your park away and turn it into a seawall. And it's been met with protests in neighborhoods like
well, a seawall is a different, that's
so the government in that case kind of overrode some of the community's ideas and decided to build a seawall for the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. And that was met with a lot of protests. So it's if you go into a neighborhood and say,
well, rightfully in that case,
and we're going to tell you what's best to save you from flooding, people are going to have some questions about that and want to, know what you're talking about before they agree to you demolishing their home or their park. Or,
well, putting in a park is better than taking one away.
Yes.
And that they were taking those.
If it means demolishing a neighborhood to put in a wetlands, people are going to have some strong emotions about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi there. So a question I have is not to go into the details of the Hatt study, but but broadly, I think the Hatt study came out and there was a lot of negative reaction, and it feels like there's one reaction I had is that it seems that there's a lack of or a failure of regional coordination in the New York area. Not just New York City, but also New Jersey, Long Island. We don't really think about the city at that scale, and only the federal government is the entity to come in and to take on that challenge. Just kind of curious to know, especially you mentioned conversations with the RPA and NRDC, like what thoughts you both have on regional coordination opportunities for the New York City area in terms of, regional watershed management. We don't think about watersheds very often in the city, but maybe we should. And in doing so, we could potentially defend against a plan imposed from elsewhere, and kind of take some of that power and divide it up more equitably, instead of the risk that you were describing before of a Robert Moses kind of being able to take that somehow. And
I've actually been re-listening to the Power Broker, and it's definitely, that book is so wise and so smart, so interesting.
Is that because of the Vox? It's not the Vox, the 99% Invisible podcast?
No. Just
would recommend.
I read that book when I first came to New York City, and I was completely shocked. But now that I've been here for 25 years, I sort of hear it and think about it in a different kind of way. So there's a lot to be said about that. But I think that the thing I would say, to your point, is the Regional Plan Association in the last plan did a lot of work at that scale to try and understand and take seriously the kind of differences in building morphology and everything. But I don't know where this goes exactly. But the thing I think most about that is that this year is the 400-year anniversary of the colonization of New York City. This is in 1624. That was when the Dutch actually came finally to live in New York City. And how, they had this very particular idea about property, right? And that idea became our idea, became the New York City idea. And so I just been reflecting a lot recently about how deeply rooted these things are, into our culture. And not just that, but, also our kinds of governance, these layers of governance you're talking about, what actually the state boundary is between New Jersey and New York, goes back to like James II, who, his brother gives him a letter, says you get everything, you get, everything from the Delaware River to the Connecticut River and New England and Maine. So go take it. And he comes over, sails a ship and then basically tells the Dutch to get out. And that's how that's why we're speaking English now,
Right.
At one level. And he trades away New Jersey to settle a gambling debt. And so that's why New Jersey is different than New York, just like this is not the way to organize ourselves, and this is not the way to live on the planet. And yet these things, there's like such entrenched power that comes out of those ideas, right? And it's been entrenched, for 400 years. So, but we don't really have 400 years anymore to change it. So,
yeah, when I think about like 100 years from now in New York City, I'm kind of increasingly dubious about the future of a lot of the coastline of New York City because there is no citywide plan. I mean, the Hatts plan was a plan that was ostensibly citywide just to address storm surges. It wasn't going to deal with street flooding, torrential rain, sea level rise.
Right.
It was to deal with just one aspect of climate change. But it was the biggest thing proposed, and there is not something else there. If it does not go through, there is no proposal for New York City right now. I mean, for what's going to happen to New York City. So we might piecemeal. Right now we have like $4 billion of walls and barriers being built around the city, and it's like a little one here, a little one here, a little one here for $4 billion.
Yeah, and going to the wealthiest parts of the city too.
Yeah, I mean, definitely some of them, but it's kind of. Yeah, the Hatts proposal certainly was very problematic, but also, what are we proposing for New York City's future? Like there isn't currently anything.
Yeah.
But when I look at like what bioswales are not the answer, but like when I look at what the DEP has accomplished there, that is like a citywide program of like thousands of small interventions, which the city could afford, as opposed to like a massive federal intervention of $80 billion that New York City cannot afford.
Right.
We can't pay for that, so you need the federal.
Well, and at some level, the reason they did that is because the Clean Water Act, has this very high bar of like healthy, swimmable waters. The city, was not meeting it, even with all the investment in the water control plants, right? They realized the problem was about the combined sewer, so they started trying to address that. Through this sort of consent procedure and the negotiation with the state. There's a lot of like deep bureaucratic details into it, but yeah, and because we pay water rates, there was actually money to pay for that kind of infrastructure improvements. So
maybe like I'm saying,
like there can be mechanisms without like redoing, like starting over from scratch. You know what I mean? Like,
and it could be like smaller interventions that proliferate
and add up
to a massive. Here's a giant wall we're going to dump on your landscape that nobody's going to be too happy about.
Yeah,
it's different approaches. Which honestly, I mean, the city doesn't have the funding to pay to protect the entirety of its 520 miles of coastline. It's just not feasible.
I think let's take a question from our audience on Zoom now. So someone is asking, why isn't most/all street work semi-permeable? You always hear about DEP managing this, but DOT controls streets, which is much of the impermeable land. All bulb outs could be semi-permeable, which would make them more effective for both flood control and traffic safety.
Yeah, well, there definitely are lots of thoughts about permeable structures. Part of the cloudburst interventions is putting in permeable things. One of the things I've heard said about them is, all these, whether it's a bioswale or rain garden or permeable pavers, that's all about putting water in the ground. There is other stuff in the ground, right? Just remember that's where the subways are. That's where some wires are. There's a lot of pipes down there. There's like other things in the ground, and moreover, even in the forest, the ground is useful for things. That's where the roots are. there's organisms live down there, it's not like
It's not empty space.
it's not empty
Yeah.
space, and that doesn't just solve the problem by itself. And then the other problem with permeable pavers is you have to clean them. They get clogged up because there's so much dirt. And some of the concerns I've heard anecdotally about how much money it costs to send a crew out, with the truck that blows the thing to open up it's very expensive. So I totally agree, but I don't think that in itself is it's probably part of the solution, but it's not going to be the full solution in itself, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's a piecemeal approach. I mean, there's like a lot of smaller interventions we can do and then some larger things as well. But, it does come down to kind of money and time. Like we don't have a lot of time before sea level is predicted to start more severely impacting the city and the rainfall starts flooding more and more intensely because of sea level rise and the intensity of storms. But there are some limits to what we can accomplish. Like you said, we don't have 400 years
to work it out.
Reconfigure New York City. We're pretty far behind like Amsterdam or some of these cities that have been working on it for centuries.
I know another idea they talked about in Cloudburst that like they use in Denmark is, if you look at the way the streets are designed, they're designed to shed the water to the sides, to the gutters, but you could design them the other way, especially if it's long and where an old stream could be. And so, there's a big rain event, you close the street and you just let it be a river for, 36 hours. And then, it dries up and then you open it again, right? Like, that's another kind of solution. But like, I think we need these like out of the box kind of solutions. And then there's even the more out of box, like, well, what if it wasn't always about cars in New York City, right? Like if we had a better public transportation system, or what I wrote about in my book Terra Nova is about streetcars. And then there's this amazing streetcar system once upon a time in New York City. That, those can run in grassy spaces that are permeable, et cetera, et cetera. Like, and this is one of the things that comes out of landscape ecology. You always think about like, what is the assumption that you're starting your analysis or your discussion with? And then what if you remove that assumption? What if you made a different assumption? What if you thought about a bigger area or you know what I mean? Like it's an ecological problem we have, right? We got to be moving around. We have to have housing, but we also need to be flood proof and we need nature, right? So, and these things are all at the landscape scale. And so it's important to sort of pull out the threads between them so that we can understand which is the biggest lever to pull.
I've been intending to ask you a question for a while because you look at the whole history of New York City going back to like, last ice age or earlier, this whole landscape here. Like, was it a good idea to have New York City built here at the conflux of this massive river and the ocean? Like, was it just not a very good idea for us to start developing it into this massive urban hub? I mean,
well, no. It was a good place for a city. If you look at where cities are anywhere in the world, what are the things you want for a good city? Well, so you need water, you need fresh water, you need soil. There's this important relation between cities and agriculture, right? So you need to be able to have food and you need to have water. You need transport because cities are a lot about mercantilism and trade, right? So whether that's a river or the coast or whatever, and then you need to have a place that's defensible. Right. And so that's what the Dutch were really thinking. When they first came in 1624, they settled on Governor's Island because they were like, that's the safest place to be. Yeah. And they were thinking not so much about the Native Americans, but the British and the Swedes who were down in the Delaware River Valley. They're their colonial powers. And then they realized there's only one lousy spring on Governor's Island and it's not going to work. So then the next year they moved over to Manhattan, because of the Clock Pond in Lower Manhattan. And you think about it, like the tip of Manhattan, defended on water by three sides, very deep harbor, right, very adjacent because of the geology, a freshwater pond, and then, Brooklyn and Queens and even parts of Manhattan were okay for growing food for a while. So that's why they settled there. Yeah. And then once the city gets started, then the city tends to build outward from there. Because it's always easier to build on the edge of the city than it is to start anew someplace completely different.
Let's take one more from the Zoom. And then I know we're close to ending time.
Yeah, we should wrap up.
So Parks manages 40% of the blue zones. Some of that 40% presumably includes landscaped parks. What are the levers to get the agency to reconsider/redesign these non-natural areas to provide hydrological ecosystem services?
Yeah, well, I know that the Parks Department and DP regularly meet iron out all those kind of details. Yeah. And I think, so again, they're trying. The parks people, I think it's fair to say, they would say the parks mean many things to many people.
Right.
They're not just about water control. And so, people want baseball fields for a reason, right? People advocate for that, the playgrounds, as well as the natural areas. One interesting idea that's come out of Rainproof is to formalize the protection for natural areas. We have, 10,000 acres of forest and wetlands in New York City. Most of this area is in city parks. Most of it was, if you look on the map of the 1960s, it's like the place to be built someday. Like, just like not enough funds to build on yet. So they're like the reserved areas. But, we've subsequently learned over the last 50 years that they're really valuable in their own right. You see these Forever Wild signs in city parks. That's a really great thing, but that's just a sign, basically. It doesn't mean anything legally. There's no legal protection. So I think if we're gonna, I think that's a really good move. That's not going to solve the problem on its own, but that's a really important thing to say. Those places are secure, and that we're going to allocate funding to maintain them as forests and wetlands into perpetuity. So that's not a complete answer to the question, but
Yeah, I mean, I
I think
feel
that
like
starts to move us in the right direction.
the Parks Department is working actively to try to protect, but even to like rebuild some of the wetlands that have vanished. Like they have a wetlands management framework that came out a couple of years ago,
That's right.
which the intent was to highlight places where you could actually reclaim, sections of the waterfront and rebuild these salt marsh habitats or wetland habitats. And that, what was interesting within that framework, I wrote an article about it, and what was interesting within it was one of the first times where the city, the Parks Department being an agency of the city, like actively said that they were pursuing a managed retreat process, because it was kind of something they didn't like to talk about up until then.
Yeah.
But they were saying within that, the neighborhoods on the waterfront could be demolished, homes could be purchased in order to allow the marsh to migrate inland, and in order to kind of allow the marshland to expand, because we have that problem. I mean, we built to the edge of the city, and the marshland doesn't have a place to go to proliferate. So they were talking about parks that might be forested turning into wetlands as flooding and as sea levels continue to rise, and then talking about neighborhoods being bought actively right now, that they're planting marshland in these neighborhoods. It's happening in Hamilton Beach, according to that report. They're purchasing homes and planting wetlands to be like green spaces. So,
yeah. Okay.
Thank you everyone so much for coming and joining us. You will have time for those of you in person to join Eric for a semi-tour maybe, but also just converse with one another if you have other questions. And for our folks on Zoom, thank you so much for joining. I think we'll end the webinar here. And just thank you all for coming. And thank you to our panelists and Christian.